Well, greetings and welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Outpost podcast. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host, and thank you so much for joining me for another conversation, maybe monologue that you react to. I can't really call it a dialogue because it's just me. But given that as it is, I have plenty to talk about in terms of the nature of relationships within the Outpost. And we've got lots of things beginning to develop on that front that are pretty big, I think, that will hit. And we'll see when it hits. I'm not going to make any promises, but I think we've got some important stuff to engage in and find out about, and maybe learn a little bit more. So the Outpost, if you've never listened before, is a digital place where we're trying to build bridges back to faith or to strengthen the ones that already exist. And there are four fundamental pillars or values that we have that are part of this. One is authenticity, to be WYSIWYG people. What you see is what you get. And we are oftentimes edited people. You might even say we're curated people as well. And the second one is trust, and living in trust, not only learning how to do that with one another, but also to live trustingly, otherwise known as faith, with our relationship with God and Jesus. And then the third one is grace and learning. That's what I want to talk about tonight, grace, learning what exactly it is outside of a theological concept. What does it look like within the context of just living life with others and with myself and all of that? And then the final one is intimacy, my commitment to knowing and being known by others. And what do I have to do to be able to do that? And one of the key strategies for the Outpost is to develop places that are safe to be able to be known and know others, and a space where the doubters and the wounded and the confused and beat up and beat down and bent and bruised, who feel like their lives are a disappointment to God, can feel accepted enough to know and know others. And we want to be a place ultimately where we embody the truth of relationship and display what the heart of Jesus actually is. And that's not an easy task. It sounds quaint and nice, and I think it's a bigger thing than we can imagine. So wherever you are, get comfortable, settle in, and let's talk about some of these issues. One of the things that I've been thinking about here, because we're starting out a new year. Technically, we're 3 episodes away from starting a new season for the Outpost. But what I've been thinking about is a reaffirmation and maybe a rediscussion of some of the issues of the fabric of relationships in the Outpost, or in the context of our relationships. And if we follow the metaphor of the Outpost being a place that is safe enough for us to be able to learn and to grow and to connect and all of those things, then what's the nature of the relationships within that Outpost? Now, granted, it's a digital one. I certainly hope over time, or maybe over this year, Lord willing, is that we will actually have little outposts around where people can go and be safe and to be known and encouraged and supported and challenged and all of those things. And what I want to do is unpack a little bit of what the relationships, what are the key issues or the key dimensions of these relationships. And before we answer what is the nature of the relationships in Outposts, I think we've got to dig just a little bit deeper. And some questions that come to my mind as we go into that is why one of the things that I say, the 4 values, is truth and grace and the whole idea of intimacy and authenticity, right? And truth and grace. And grace I want to focus in about because We love to rhapsodize about grace, but we don't have the first clue about what it looks like to live in grace, to live graciously even. And so I think we have to ask the question, why is it that we find grace so scandalous as Christians? I have read innumerable journals over the years of people, and young people particularly, who really doubt that this is really true. And so if we doubt it, and it really isn't that scandalous, because it doesn't tilt our worlds a little bit, because we turn it into something that it's not. And we turn grace into a contract. Yeah, I will do this, so God will do that. Oh, and if I don't do this, then I'll get punished. And grace doesn't give us a pass to do whatever we want. I mean, Paul was pretty clear about that, and there was a whole group of Christians, baby Christians in the Roman church at the time, that he said that it had this notion floating around amongst them that we should sin all the more so that grace may abound. And he just flatly closed the door on that and said, may it never be. And so because we don't understand what it looks like to live graciously, then we just simply turn it into something easier to understand, and that usually is a contract. And therefore, we make a contract that God never signs. And so that's the first question. Second question is, for something that is so central and so fundamental to our faith, why are there so many obstacles to it? Because you would think that, as the song, John Newton's song, Amazing Grace, implies, that it is so amazing that it's almost irresistible. And in the absolute and even in the theoretical, that's true. But our lives are not characterized by grace. The world, for sure, the world we live in, sure as heck isn't characterized by grace. There's very little grace in the world that we live in. And so for something that is so fundamental to our faith, and we espouse and rhapsodize and sermonize about, why are there so many obstacles? And then, excuse me, if we had it, and this is just a question of my own, and I don't know that anybody else really thinks it, but if we had it at one point in our lives, why did we lose it? Or how did we lose it? And there's probably plenty of answers to that are many more than I could ever begin to enumerate. But what has contributed to our inability to not grasp, but live out grace in our internal world and in our external world? And there are contributing factors. I'm sure there are. I certainly have seen them over the years of talking to people. And so there's a flip side of this coin. So you take the coin of life, and on one side you have grace, and on the other side you have a dark side of it, and that is shame. And we have to ask the question, why is shame so comfortable? Because we talk grace, but we live shame, ultimately. And are there those of us who are more prone for being controlled by shame? Is there people that seem to struggle with it more than others? Well, let's be clear. We're all marinating in the same pot called shame, to such a degree that we don't even notice it, really, until somebody like me that starts pointing things out, and we are politely saying thank you, and under our breath we're saying leave me alone. So how do we let go of living in shame but talking grace? And why is never enough such a problem? Those are just a few questions that come to mind as a result of not only teaching about shame and grace, but also just being a part of the conversations with people. And I couldn't even begin to count the number of hours that I put in talking to people over 40 years of doing that. So the thing I want to highlight before I ever get into this at all is that I think all of us would say that grace has the power to transform us. But I think we have to ask, is there a difference between transformation and reformation? Because reformation, I think personally, and I look even at myself, reformation is far more comfortable than transformation is. Because reformation takes personal effort and precision and measurement. I got to compare it against something else. But ultimately, all the building materials of me stay the same. They don't change at all. And I think in a lot of cases, when we move from, and Paul talks about this in Romans, he says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And conformed there carries with it the idea of the Play-Doh factory. I think those things are still around. And you put the Play-Doh in and you have this lever that you push it through and it presses it out into a form. Merry Christmas. That is conformation. It is being conformed to whatever the world dictates to us. And so he says, move from confirmation to transformation. And I think, and this is my own private little theory, I think we put an additional step in there. And that step is reformation. It is a very comfortable place to land, and it has all the benefits of looking like transformation. And so reformation is something that is within my grasp to do. I can achieve it. I can create the objectives necessary to look the right way. But it's like a movie set. And you look behind, you might see a boulder wall, but then you look behind it and it's just scaffolding. And so they've reformed the materials to look like a boulder wall, but it isn't. And so I think we settle for an intermediate step that we have inserted. Paul didn't talk about it that way, and I think he didn't talk about it that way for a reason. But he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, transformation, it takes three things, just like reformation does. I said reformation takes personal effort and precision and measurement. Transformation takes time and trust and freedom. And ultimately, the materials are changed, which is us, right? And so time, trust, and freedom. And the middle one is the stumbling block. Because when I have to trust something or someone, then I lose some measure of control over the outcome because I'm trusting them with it. And that's why I say all the time, and all my students who might be listening would be already reciting in their head what I'm about to say, is that trust and control cannot coexist. And so one of the things that I want to show you, or I can't really show you, but I can point you to and describe it for you, because of course when when you're doing a podcast like this, you really can't show anybody anything. But there was a movie, I can't believe it's been a dozen years ago now, that was made of a very popular theatrical production called Les Miserables. And there are three different moments in that movie that are, I think, key to help us to understand what transformation looks like. And so the main character is a man by the name of Jean Valjean. And if you're familiar with this, you probably know at least the story arc here. And Valjean is unjustly imprisoned. He was imprisoned for 19 years. And he's finally let out, but he's given a writ of some kind of suspension that he has to carry with him and present to anybody who might employ him, and which essentially makes him unemployable. And so he goes from city to city, and he lands in the doorway of a church as the only place he can find to sleep. And the priest comes along and invites him in and feeds him, has a warm fire, and and essentially a warm bed. And Valjean eats and lays down to go to sleep, but he stays awake because he knows that the church usually has some pretty valuable metals, silver, candlesticks, and etc., that he could use to trade for more money. And so eventually he does. He gathers it all up, throws it in a bag, and runs out. And eventually he is caught and drugged back to the church with all the loot that he had taken. And so he was caught stealing. And so he's taken back to the priest, and the gendarme, the police officer, says, "We caught him with all this stuff." And he says, "You gave it to him." And in this tremendously powerful moment, the priest looks at the police officer and says, "Yes, I did, and you left something behind," which was another valuable pair of candlesticks. And so the priest then says that with this silver, I am purchasing your soul for God, and go on your way. And essentially Valjean does, and makes a life for himself, and uses obviously uses the precious metals to get set up in a factory and becomes the mayor of the city. And there's lots of twists and turns, but all during this time, there is a particular police inspector, that is hunting him down by the name of Javert. And after the priest consecrates him to God with what he steals, and it's a very obvious act of grace, Valjean struggles with the grace that's been offered him. And he debates about fleeing into anonymity and starting over again, and dealing with a life that dealt with him so unfairly. And so eventually he leaves and becomes a mayor, and eventually adopts a little girl as his own. And her mom has gotten sick and eventually dies. And so this inspector tracks him the entire movie. And eventually the girl falls in love with a guy who is part of the French Revolution, which started with students. And so they have a barricade, and as the story goes, he's a part of that group, and they're getting fired upon. And Javert, the police inspector, disguises himself as one of them so he can get inside information about what's going on there and to undermine what they're attempting to do. And Valjean, if you can follow this, Valjean goes to save his daughter's love interest from utter extinction, because they are so outclassed and outgunned by the French army. And so he goes to try to save him, and who does he meet but Javert? And Javert is taken into custody because he's revealed as a spy, and the leader of the group, a student group, gives him to Valjean. So he catches him, and he cuts him free, and with a knife. And Javert says, "How ironic that you would kill me with a knife." And I'm not going to give you all the blow by blow details here. It's not worth that. But he catches his enemy, and he ends up actually giving to him what the priest gave to Valjean. And Joubert has no idea. He is law and order, justice all the way. And he says something that caught my attention as I was listening to it, because he says, you will always be what you have always been. Once a thief, always a thief. And that is the voice of shame. And then you have, on the other hand, Valjean, who says back to him, look, there is nothing I desire. No bargains, no petitions. You are free. And that is the voice of grace. And so we have this struggle between these two things. And ultimately, in some respects, that struggle goes on within us. And so the thing I want to try to characterize is two things about any one person's relationship with others within the context of what I'm calling the outpost. And listen, I am not a theologian, and neither am I a son of a theologian. I am none of those things. I've done enough study, and I have seen it in context and in context of relationships to have some good idea of this, but I am not going to try to address this question theologically. But what I want to focus on is the grace that's needed to live life differently. And ultimately, what the Bible refers to that as is sanctification. And the thing I want to nail down as we move into this is that grace is the beginning of our healing because it offers us the one thing we need the most: to be accepted without regard to whether we are acceptable. I'll say it again: to be accepted without regard to whether we are acceptable. One is the act of the one offering it to us to be accepted, and without regard to whether we are acceptable, which is usually our assessment of how much we deserve or don't deserve it. So ultimately, what grace ends up doing for us is it creates a space for us to exercise and choose freedom instead of enslavement. And we'll talk about that more when we get to unpacking shame, because shame is all about enslavement. It's about limiting and constraining and obligating. But grace creates a space for freedom. It creates a space to learn a new way of relating and relating to other people and relating to ourselves. And it also creates a space for us to actually learn more about ourselves, because the more we spend time condemning ourselves, the less time we spend even noticing what's going on within ourselves, because it's all condemned if we do it that way. So there's some highlights here I want to hit as I try to get into this, and this is probably going to carry me into the next episode, but how do we experience grace? And I think first and foremost, we experience grace as pardon. And so when we repent to someone else, and I'm not going to say apologize, because I think we have lost the art of repentance. But I think when we experience grace as pardon, which is actually the answer to our guilt, which is true guilt. Guilt is when I feel when I feel guilty, when I feel convicted, when I feel motivation to change by the things that I have done. Not who I am, but what I've done. So we experience grace as pardon. We experience grace as acceptance, which ultimately, grace is the antidote to shame. Now, when you read and begin to grasp what Brené Brown has talked about in terms of shame, and it's all good. There's very little that I debate about in what she's written. But shame, the antidote to shame, is not just connection. Ultimately, it is grace. And learning to live in grace, being convinced and even trusting that we are loved as we are, not as we should be, because we will never be what we should be. So we experience grace as acceptance, and that gives us an answer to our shame. And then a third one is that we experience grace as power, the power to move toward our true self, the one that is anchored in our relationship with others and with God. And so it provides us a power that we would not otherwise have, because we actually trust and believe that, not say what we believe, not say what, there's a difference here, and don't miss that point, because we are really good at telling you what we believe, but then we live some other way. So our belief falls apart. But we experience grace as gratitude as well. So not only power, but gratitude. It gives us a sense of the gift of life, the lavish generosity of people offering us grace, even if they don't know it. But we, Brennan Manning, I had him as a mentor for a period of time, and he would often say, we are living in a God-saturated universe. If we just opened our eyes, we would see the lavish generosity of God for us and the grace that he offers us for the freedom that comes along with it. The other thing I want to mention and kind of highlight and underline is that grace and growth are always connected. You know, when you think about it, when kids are growing up, they need a lot of grace. I think without grace, my kids would not have made it out of childhood. And that's not an implicit threat. It is just a statement of fact. But children grow knowing nothing but love and grace. In most cases. There are lots of sad cases that is not true, and I understand that. But grace encourages growth because human limits are accepted. They are expected. And so there's an understanding that growth comes from adapting to our limits and the mistakes that we make. And so grace creates this environment and an environment for growth. And shame does not. And I am making this distinction, but I can't get into a lot of detail with that. But shame is about compliance, not about growth. And so grace allows for what I call crock-pot growth, not a microwave product. And that growth is in the nature of who we are and how free we could be if we actually believed we were accepted as we are. And then last thing I want to mention is just grace in everyday life. Because grace is intertwined and inevitably tangled with learning. Because learning allows us space to make mistakes. There are always going to be failures in learning, always. And so grace allows the space to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to grow from them. It encourages taking risks to try something new even. And when kids are younger, they do. They find out. And they might make a mistake, right? And the funny thing about it is, if you look at your mechanical pencil or even just, old school pencil, there's this pink thing on the other end of it, and that testifies to our expectation that we are going to make mistakes. Funny thing is that as we write the lines of our lives, we act as if there's no eraser, and there can't be an eraser, because when a mistake occurs, it is catastrophic, not expected. And so grace in everyday life includes learning. It also includes forgiveness, because it expects human weakness and limits. It's very much a part of the backdrop to relationships. Forgiveness is the oil for relationships. It understands not only that, but it also understands the level of our own forgiveness without shame. Because the minute I enter shame into it, so somebody says, I forgive you, and I make the conclusion, I am such an awful person that I don't deserve that forgiveness, and I have effectively insulated myself from what is being offered me in the grace offered in forgiveness. And so grace and forgiveness, it realizes that grace is giving away what we couldn't afford to others who can't possibly repay their offense. And that's really what it's all about. Henry Nouwen, the very well-known, he wrote a number of books. Henry was trained as a psychologist, but he was a Catholic priest. And he defined forgiveness as love practiced among people who love poorly. And that truly is part of the backdrop to our lives. So we may aspire to grace, but we end up still in shame because there's so much undefined and there's so much that requires trust that we don't know. And so the other part of this that is kind of a shadow that you don't necessarily see is the whole idea of grace and self-acceptance. And ultimately, it accepts the gift that is given us freely and accepts it with gratitude, which takes us back to what I was talking about before. And ultimately, when I allow for such acceptance, self-acceptance, it cultivates humility and my sense of need. And I'm not saying neediness. I'm just saying need. And I'm reminded of it every day, all the time. There are lots of things I don't pay any attention to. And yet it is pointing to my sense of need. So grace and self-acceptance is very much a part of that. And then the last item that I'll mention is what I call the grace and the well. Because Proverbs talks about our heart being a wellspring of life, the well. And we are called to care for it and cultivate it. And out of that, Jesus says, a good man brings good things out of the good treasure of his heart. And the evil man does what is there as well. So there's a lot that goes into our understanding of grace, and because we understand it so superficially, we reduce it to something that it's not. And it's usually a cheap substitute for a contractual relationship with people that I do it, if I do it, you will do it too. And if you don't do it, then you're being ungracious. But I don't know how to be gracious with myself, so I end up looking to people to giving me what I have never really figured out how to accept myself. And that puts people in a pretty awkward spot if you really want to know about it. So grace is an important, fundamental concept of our faith, and we seem to know so little about it, particularly in our internal world. And you can say, well, that really doesn't matter that much. After all, it's what I do for others that really matters. And the well will run out if all my focus is entirely on everything external to me. That well will run dry, and it won't be really a well at all. It'll be more like a ditch. Water flows in and water flows out. I want to cultivate a reservoir out of which the overflow actually flows into people's lives and enriches and graces and encourages them as a result of that overflow. But I have to care for the boundaries of that reservoir. So this is the first installment. I want to spend a little time talking about grace in the next episode. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of that I think is important to understand, because this should characterize the relationships within the Outpost. Our tendency is to reduce grace down to, oh, that's okay. And it isn't. Grace is an incredibly powerful means by which to encourage and even challenge people to face the consequences of poor choices without deflecting them off on everybody else. And so there's a little bit more that I want to get at, and I will get at it in the next episode. And until then, thanks for joining me. You are sgi-net.org is the home for the SGI community. And if you have any questions, feel free to DM me on Instagram or just use the contact form on the website. And you can also send a message to me that way. We would encourage you to subscribe. If you go to the website, you'll become part of the community. There's a little annoying pop-up that comes up. And if you join the community, then you'll be able to get the newsletter. And the newsletter that usually has some devotional reading and challenge reading in it, and also an update of things that are coming. And there are things coming. I mentioned in the last episode that there are a couple different things that I want to make you aware of on the SGI website. And we had sent it out in the newsletter as well. But the groups we're trying to get ready to go launch our groups. And so the way to do that is to go to our groups page on the website. There's a drop down and it says Outpost Groups, and there's a QR code there that you can use to fill out a survey or a questionnaire that helps us to understand what the need is, or even the interest or the lack of interest, whichever you prefer. So it's there, and that will give us an idea of how much we need to, or what we need to do, or how to respond to build leaders up, and also to create a convergence of people in a particular area so that we can support and resource and encourage along the way through all of that. And that's on the website under groups, and fill out the QR code, the questionnaire that comes with it. And we would happily receive the feedback and get back to you as soon as we possibly can, and hopefully be able to birth a few groups that will be anchor places and outposts for us to meet and to show and display some of the things that I'm talking about here. So you can subscribe on the website. You can follow the podcast on whatever platform you tend to listen to. If you're interested, there's digital devotionals on the website that you can take a part of that is about healthy relationships. There's a variety of resources that you can take advantage of there. Of course, you can follow us on 3 different social media outlets: at Instagram, at SGI_international. On Facebook, Stained Glass International. And LinkedIn, this is a new one, Stained Glass International there. Imagine that. So follow us on those as well, just to keep up with what's going on. And if you're interested in partnering with us, we would be ever so grateful for your partnership. All gifts, all donations, everything is tax deductible. And we are trying to rebuild our scholarship fund for the silent retreats that will be being developed over the coming months here. So there's all sorts of things on the website, including my newest book, The Seasons of Our Grief. So I think that's it for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been my pleasure. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, love ya. Later. Bye.